great, lovely. Okay, well, I'll make a start. Um, I'm at a disadvantage in that I don't have a crystal ball, unfortunately. So I can't say precisely what's going to happen in 2021. But what I'm going to do is to try and look at the different elements that are going to shape the outlook for pay and reward in 2021 and beyond. That'll include, by the way, forecasts for inflation alongside a look at the labour market. And at the end, I'll try and muse a little bit on the different pressures in both directions on pay and reward in what's a very, very challenging time for all of us. I'm sure you'll agree. So let's get started. I'll just move on to my next slide. So in terms of the immediate outlook for the coming year, we've begun to monitor pay awards for this year, and we've got a sample of 30 or so awards, and that's building up all the time across the private sector. There's no public sector awards effective in January, or very few as far as I know. And you can see from that our median is 2.2%. Now, if you contrast that or compare that with what Zoe said earlier about the overall median outcome for 2020, that was 2.3%. So there's a number of points to be made, I think. One is that it's kind of in line, but a little bit below the overall outcome for last year. So that's one point. That could indicate a kind of continued drifting down in the median. But the other point is that it indicates that organisations are still awarding increases in pay, and that's very important. Okay, that's great. Okay, so that median, which, like I say, is 2.2%, that indicates that organisations are still awarding pay increases, and obviously that's a reflection of the fact that even though we're in a lockdown, economic activity is still continuing, and organisations need to continue to reward their staff. I've made the point about it being a little bit lower than the overall outcome for 2020 last year. So whether that's a harbinger of more to come, we'll have to see. But the other point is that as a median, this obviously reflects a variety of outcomes, and we've talked about that already this morning. And I think that's probably going to be a key theme for the year. That's not a prediction as such, but my guess is that will probably be a key theme. And if you move down the slide to look at the third last bullet point, the third from the bottom, we've been in touch with organisations, and we asked them in terms of their pay reward for 2021, whether it will be higher, lower, or the same. And just over half thought that they would award a lower level of increase than they did last year. But a fifth, on the other hand, feel that this year's award will actually be higher than last year's. So that should give you a feel for how this year might compare with last year. But obviously, let's see how that develops. And the other point to make, I think, is that the pandemic, the societal response to that, the lockdown or the semi-lockdown that we're currently in at the moment, has slowed pay decisions down. And again, when we've been in touch with organisations, most of them haven't yet decided on their 2021 pay award yet. And about a quarter of that group told us that they would usually have made their decision by now. So the pandemic is kind of having a dampening effect on decision making in organisations. And Zoe gave us a little bit of a flavour of that earlier, but I just wanted to emphasise that with some survey findings. I think there's going to be a number of things that underlie decisions on pay this year. The issue of well-being that's been highlighted by the earlier speakers, encompassing both physical and mental health, I think is very important. Equalities and fairness are in the mix as well, and by that I mean pressures for greater equality and greater fairness. and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about that later. But there's another element as well, which maybe cuts across the other two, or at least has to be kept in balance alongside the other two. And that's many organizations are looking to try and keep their costs in check as well. And that's obviously an important influence on the outlook for reward. A couple of other elements that I wanted to highlight before I move on. One is that, as well as differences between firms, I think what we're going to see is maybe differences in outcomes within organizations as well. One of the themes of outcomes this year has been that some organizations have made lower pay rises to higher paid staff and higher rises to lower paid staff. And that was a key theme. And I'd imagine that that will probably continue. And the other thing that we might see is targeted increases at particular roles in order to retain retain essential skills. And that arises in a number of areas. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And Louisa, in a later presentation, is going to go into some detail on that and the backdrop to it. So that's one point before I move on. A second point before I move on is, at this point in the year, very, very early in the pay round, people like yourselves are always looking for indicators as to what they might do. You know, you're looking at what other organisations might be doing, and I've mentioned our median. Obviously, that's important. It also happens that the national minimum wage is set to rise this year from the 1st of April at exactly that level, 2.2%. Which is interesting. I don't think it's entirely coincidental. We do provide evidence to the Low Pay Commission, which sets the national minimum wage. So obviously that's had an influence, but it just so happens that our current median is the same as the planned rise in the national minimum wage. So that'll be a key influence, particularly on organisations with large numbers of lower paid staff. The other influence, I think, and this has come up in discussion already, will be the pay rise for NHS staff. Now, NHS staff are set to be the only major public sector pay group over whose pay the government has an influence to receive a pay award. And as we speak, the pay review body has begun its deliberations on what the pay increase for those staff might be. There's no doubt it's clearly well deserved now more than ever. And it will be very interesting to see what increase they get, and it may yet have an influence beyond the public sector, which is unusual because it's not always the case, or it's very rarely the case, that public sector pay decisions have an influence on the private sector. But we're in unusual times, and I think that might have an influence there as well. There was a question earlier about what influence the policy per se would have. And I think one sector to look at in all of this is the care sector, because clearly those staff have been under similar pressures to their counterparts in the NHS, but they're mainly employed by either private or not-for-profit companies, and their funding comes through local government, whose funding has been restricted, you know, prior to the pandemic. So it'll be very interesting to see, you know, what is possible in that sector and what pay increases are awarded in that sector. I think the policy in the public sector of moving to a freeze pretty rapidly, I might say, a little bit in contrast to maybe government reactions to the pandemic generally. It'll be interesting to see what influence that has. So those are 2 points before I move on. The other key influence on the outlook is what might happen with inflation, and I've got a slide on that. I'll just move to that, and hopefully people can see it okay. So we're in regular touch with a panel of economists at city organisations, banking and finance organisations, as well as economics consultancies, and we get a regular take from them on what they think the outlook for inflation looks like. And the panel this time includes Capital Economics, Deutsche Bank, Heteronomics, Lloyds Banking Group, NatWest Markets, and Societe Generale. And what we've done with this chart here is we've averaged all 6 of those organizations' forecasts for both the RPI in blue and the CPI in orange. And you can see that what it shows is a broad drift upwards in inflation. The latest figures were out today, by the way, this morning, and if you haven't seen them already, they show a small rise in both the CPI and the RPI, and so these forecasts reflect that. I think, in fact, they get the CPI bang on, which it's currently 0.6%. So they were correct, which is good for the veracity of of this panel. But what you'll see is that as we reach the year end, so these forecasts are over the medium term, really, rather than the longer term. You'll see that the forecasts as a whole see CPI rising to just below 2%, and 2%, if you'll remember, is the government's target for the CPI. And regarding RPI, it doesn't quite reach 3%. So that's the overall average, but as an average, it masks a subtle difference between two groups of the forecasters. So on the one hand, there are those that emphasize the fact that inflationary pressures are generally muted. In fact, I think the whole group would agree with that. The way the pandemic has dampened economic activity really does mean that inflationary pressures are muted, and I wouldn't try to pretend that they're anything other than that. However, one half of the group thinks that the possibility that economic demand might recover as a result of a successful vaccination program, on the one hand, plus higher costs for organisations, perhaps as a result of the new regulations around Brexit. These might combine to slightly, and I emphasize slightly, raise inflationary pressures. So there's a difference within the group between those two possibilities. And the ones that emphasize a recovery in demand on the one hand and higher costs on the other do tend to see the RPI moving to about 3% and the CPI moving to the government target of 2% before the year end. But like I say, those differences are subtle, and inflationary pressures are generally muted at the moment. And I think what all the economists would say, and I very much agree with them on this, is that the picture is uncertain. We really don't know what's going to happen. So that's the situation with inflation. I wanted to move on finally to some thoughts I've been having about the kind of more medium to longer term picture as regards pay and reward decisions. And what I've tried to do is I've tried to think about what might be the pressures on pay in both directions at the moment. And I think because of the difficulties that the economy is going through at the moment, I think it's probably fair to emphasize downward pressures in the first instance. But that doesn't mean that I don't think there are potential offsetting or countervailing pressures at the same time. And I've presented both of these on either side of the table there. So just going through the downward pressures first of all. Obviously, the state of the economy is key. A big question is what impact the vaccination programs, which currently seem to be rolling out fairly rapidly by the NHS, whether that will really have an impact on the virus. And if it does, a big question will be the impact on the economy. The figures for GDP growth, the next set of figures are due out in February, and it'll be very interesting to see what they show. They'll look backwards and they'll show the final quarter of 2020. And the hope is that figure will show continued growth in the economy and a continued bounce back from the previous contraction earlier in the year. And I think that's certainly a possibility. But the current lockdown will probably have an impact on Q1 figures in the opposite direction. So while the economy is likely to avoid a double dip, I think what you might see is more like a W as we move through the year. And in any case, it's very unlikely that the economy will return to the sort of growth that we saw prior to the pandemic, and which, by the way, was very weak. It was low single figures. And I think that's the overall economic prospect for the UK. And it's not necessarily a political statement to emphasise that Brexit will probably further weaken those broad prospects. Luckily there was a deal rather than no deal. No deal probably would have been disastrous for economic growth. But the thin deal that was done, most economists agree, makes for most likely lower growth than would have been the case if the UK had remained inside the EU. So that's a difficulty as well. So in general, what this means is there's pressure on profitability, there's a heightened focus on cost control, and as we heard earlier in the discussion, that's resulted in redundancies in many parts of the economy. There are other threats to jobs further down the line as well. Automation is one, though that depends in particular on the level of investment, which up until now has been very weak. But it also depends on the shape of the labour market in the post-Brexit context. And the thing we've seen there is that EU immigration to the UK has fallen significantly, which is not surprising given what's happened with Brexit. But on the other hand, non-EU immigration has risen quite sharply, in most instances for study purposes. Now, it could be that some of those people will remain in the UK and will continue to work in the UK and continue to contribute to our economy. And if so, that's fantastic. But it remains to be seen. So the shape of the labour market will really impact on issues like automation and the level of investment in that. So overall, I would say the pressures on pay are downward. But as I say, there is the potential for some countervailing measures as well. One of the things that we've seen in the last while, and we're likely to continue to see as a result of the shakeout from the pandemic, is the way in which some big companies, already big companies, have grown even bigger as a result of increasing market share and so on. And that's important for reward because it generally means that within those organizations, internal labor markets become rather more important than external labor markets. And that tends to produce upward pressure on pay within those organizations. So that's something to watch. We mentioned as well that despite the dampening effects of the pandemic on economic activity, it's not the case that recruitment and retention problems have disappeared entirely. Louisa mentioned that, and I think that's an important takeaway from our talk. So we've seen shortages of key roles in parts of IT, in data analytics, in transportation. Drivers' roles are obviously important, and of course health as well, a big issue for the government. And I understand too that teaching is also an area where there have been recruitment and retention issues as well. So there are a number of occupational areas where recruitment and retention pressures remain, and they'll continue to be an issue going forward, and they'll drive decisions on pay. The other point is the idea of engagement, well-being in the broad sense, employee motivation. Now, why do I mention that as a potential upward pressure? My thinking here is that what the pandemic has done and the spread of the virus is that it's injected an element of danger into jobs which were otherwise low risk. And as a result, I think all managers have had to do more in order to try and engage employees and get them to continue to do their best for their employing organisation. And I think that's changed the employee relations landscape in subtle ways, and it could begin to have an impact on reward decisions as well. I mean, one of the ways it has impacted already is the discourse around things like key workers. In the past, that term would have been generally thought to refer to public sector staff. But in the pandemic period, it also refers to delivery drivers, to retail staff, to care staff. They were already key workers, but perhaps arguably they're even more so now. So the idea of a new settlement for those people, and the idea of better paying conditions for people in those key worker roles has begun to kind of gain traction in the pandemic. And the other point as well that I think is generally an upward pressure, albeit, or at the very least, it's part of the picture, is the fact that over the last couple of years we've had two major societal developments. One is the Me Too movement, aimed at eliminating sexual discrimination in the workplace. And then the other more recent development has been the Black Lives Matter movement, aimed at dealing with racial discrimination. And I think those have had an impact and have shaped the reward landscape in perhaps indirect ways, though gender pay reporting is in part a product of debates around gender equality. And we could yet see similar regulations for reporting of ethnicity pay gaps as well in the future. A consultation on that closed back in January 2019, and we're waiting to hear the government response on it. So those are in the mix as well. And then finally, there's the possibility that what I referred to earlier, the kind of low, weak growth that the UK had been experiencing prior to the pandemic, some economists have called that secular stagnation, or a long depression. And there's the possibility that this could be a spur to trade union organisation. Certainly the last few sets of figures on trade union organisation show that the previous trend for trade union organisation numbers to fall, that had bottomed out, and numbers had begun to increase very moderately. And then there's straws in the wind, like the fact that Google staff in the US have organised a trade union. All of these things could come together, and we could begin to see more trade union activity, more trade union organisation, and quite obviously that presents a potential upward pressure on pay. But it of course remains to be seen. And I think the main point I would emphasise is that, just as with last year, I think what we're likely to see in 2021 is this kind of range of outcomes on the pay and reward front. But what's very important is, as Zoe said earlier, that we continue to get information from organisations like yourselves, and we thank you for taking part in our surveys. But we'd appeal to you to continue to give us information so that we can build up a picture and continue to tell you how that picture looks, and hopefully that will be of assistance to you when it comes to making decisions on pay and reward.